Nothing is more frustrating than pulling out a crisp piece of paper, choosing the perfect design, hitting cut, and having to end up a torn, hot mess. At 12 by 12 Cardstock Shop, we get asked a lot what the best paper is for cutting on a Silhouette or Cricut machine. So I thought it would be great to answer the question by pulling out a bunch of different papers and doing some test cuts. So today I'm going to answer what is the best paper for cutting on a Cricut or Silhouette machine. Now I started by choosing what I figured were the top papers. So I've chosen American Crafts and Bazzill varieties in smooth and textured. I feel like those are pretty much the ones that most people use. Those are the ones that we carry in the shop along with some others. But these are the ones that are most commonly used when cutting on a Cricut or Silhouette machine. Now before I reveal my final results on cutting, I wanted to give you a few bonus tips and talk about some of the most common problems you might have when cutting. Now the first one is when you're cutting, you'll have straight parts, you'll have curves, and you'll have corners. Those are kind of the three parts of a cut file. So if you see in your file that you are having problems all over the place, so maybe it's skipping along the straight parts, it's having problems on the corners, and it's having problems on the curves, you probably have a pressure problem, which means your pressure is just a little too low and you probably need to bump up your pressure just a little to get smoother cuts. That's an indication that your blade is not going deep enough through the paper to get it a clean cut. Now I have a bonus tip for that. I usually hit double cut when I'm cutting, and that just ensures that if there's any pieces that get missed the first time, that it will catch it on the second time and I'll be able to peel it off and have a nice clean cut. But if you're having that problem and you try adjusting your pressure up or down and you're still having issues, it might not be a pressure problem. It could have something to do with the paper. Now the second problem you might have is if it's cutting fine on the straight parts, but on the corners, it's not cutting all the way through. And you'll see it almost looks like a smush. So it's pulling and tearing and kind of smushing that corner rather than just skipping and not getting a clean cut. It's actually tearing and smushing. Smushing is the best description, smushing the paper. That's actually an indication that your pressure might be a little bit too high. You might want to back off your pressure a little bit. What's happening is that it hits those corners, the pressure's too high and it's dragging the paper as it's trying to cut. So it might be counterintuitive. You might think, oh, I need to bump up the pressure because it didn't cut all the way through. But if it's just the corners having the problems and you see that smushing, try decreasing your pressure. And the third problem you might have is you'll see some papers as they're cutting and you're removing the pieces that come out. You'll see that the layers of the paper, the top layer of the paper is actually peeling apart and you'll have little kind of feathery pieces that are sticking up. That is just an indication of paper quality. So not all papers are created equal. There's a couple issues that determine what cuts best, so let's cover those next. So when paper is created, it's all created pretty much in the same manner, but the ratio of ingredients in the paper can be a little bit different. So you'll notice some papers, if you have a variety of brands, you'll notice some papers are what I call mushier. They're just softer and they almost have kind of a wet humidity feel. Those papers generally do not cut well as papers that have kind of a rough finish on the top, so it might feel like it's not quite a finished paper. Those ones usually have issues as well, and that's just due to the contents of what is used in the paper. So that's something to watch out for. You want a paper that's nice, crisp paper that doesn't feel mushy or rough on the top, kind of unfinished. So construction paper would be a good example of that. Construction paper is not going to cut well. It's thin and it has that rough, unfinished finish on the top. And then the second thing that affects paper quality is what they use to finish the top of the paper. So some papers have kind of a plasticky finish. It doesn't look like plastic, but as you cut, you'll notice that it definitely has more of a plasticky finish on top. And those are the papers that do that feathering thing, where the actual layers of the paper, there's separate layers to the paper. And so as you cut, those layers will peel and lift. So the highest quality paper is going to be all one solid sheet so that you're not getting those layers and the feathering. So after all my test cutting, let me give you my rankings. My first choice is American Crafts Precision Cardstock. This cut super well, had no issues. And it actually did fabulous. There are a couple small spots that it missed, but overall it's a really clean cut. So I'm very impressed with this. That's a tricky file to cut, so small, but it did great. And you'll notice in the shop, some of the papers are labeled precision and some are not. That's just a branding on the packaging. All the paper is the same. It's always been known to cut very well. And so American Crafts is just embracing that and changing some of their branding and some of the names on the paper. But any of the American Crafts textured cardstock is pretty much the same and will cut great. My next pick is Bazzill Card Shop, and this is the 100-pound weight paper. It's a little bit thicker. I cut on a Cricut Maker and I used the heavyweight cardstock setting, and I bumped up the pressure a bit because I did a small test cut and it wasn't cutting through. So I cut once and it wasn't cut through, and then I did a second pass. So we will see if it's now gonna peel up, but it looks like it cut pretty smoothly. All right, this actually cut great. All the tiny pieces came up, even those ones I was concerned about. These just perfectly clean cuts everywhere. Card Shop's a great option. It is a bit more expensive, but it cuts great. You need to use a little bit more pressure, but you'll have good results. My next choice is American Crafts Smooth paper. This cut well, had just a few tiny issues, but overall it peeled up great, no issues. Then my next pick is Bazzill Smooth, and both of the Bazzill ones had issues. So next up is Bazzill Smoothies, and you can see it didn't really cut all the way through in some parts. I tried to help some of these pieces out, and there's still quite a few that are stuck more than I can get without ripping. So I would say this did not cut very clean. You can see right here there's actually a piece that's still connected at the corner, and here as well. And it just seemed to have issues where if the pressure got too high, I had problems with the corners, and if the pressure was too low, it wasn't cutting, cleanly, and I just didn't have great results with it. And then the one that I would say is a no-go is Bazzill Mono or Bazzill 4s. Those both have textures. Here is a Bazzill test cut. This is cut on Bazzill Red, which is a textured Bazzill Mono variety, and as you can see, Bazzill does have some issues cutting. It's almost like the paper gets a little bit fuzzy, and the corners aren't nice and neat. And then as you can see here, sometimes this happens where it kind of peels, so there's a piece that's kind of peeled up. They just don't cut well. They have such a beautiful texture for layers, and there's definitely places where you'd want to use Bazzill, but if you're cutting, probably best to choose something else. I hope that was helpful. We have all these papers and more at 12x12 Cardstock Shop. You can shop all the colors all the time, and we have super fast shipping. So be sure to head over to the shop and check it out.